Anne Krueger is a senior fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, and the Harold L. and Caroline Rich Emeritus Professor of Sciences and Humanities in the Economics Department at Stanford University. Professor Krueger was first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund from 2001 to 2006. Prior to that, she had taught at Stanford and Duke universities from 1982 to 1986. She was Vice President, Economics and Research at the World Bank. She had earlier been Professor of Economics at the University of Minnesota. Professor Krueger has held visiting professorships at a number of universities, including the MIT, Northwestern University, Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, that is ICRIER, Monash University, the Australian National University, and the Stockholm Institute for International Economics. She holds a BA from Oberlin College and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. Professor Krueger is a distinguished fellow and past president of the American Economic Association, a senior research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, and the American Philosophy Society. So all of those. She has published extensively on economic development, international trade, and finance and economic policy reform. In addition to her writings on these topics, she has written a number of books and articles on India, South Korea, and Turkey within her areas of expertise. Let me just add, this was the formal introduction, but I just want to add, that Professor Krueger has had enormous influence, not just on India, but on the developing countries in particular. My recollection, particular one is the way she really changed the thinking while president. First there was the NBER study that Professor Krueger and Professor Bhagwati jointly supervised, and that was a very influential study. And then as vice president of research at the World Bank, she really changed the way people thought about trade policy. And that eventually ended up having a huge amount of impact, not just on scholars like me, who became her followers, but also on the countries, thinking within the countries. It was, at the time, the World Bank, etc., were very much criticized for pushing the reforms and liberalization and so forth. But eventually, most countries came to appreciate the value of that and adopted those policies. And you see that, 90s and 2000s onwards, growth rates really kick up in the developing countries, and that was in no small measure because of the persistent kind of advocacy of the reform policies by Professor Krueger. So it's really an honor for me to be introducing Professor Krueger and sharing the same stage with her, and I'm sure we are all in for a fantastic treat. So thank you, Professor Krueger.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Arvind. I appreciate that. And it's wonderful to be back in India. And I think the first time or the second time I came to India, the first seminar I ever gave in India was to NCAER, way back when. And so it's a pleasure to be not only back in India and enjoying it again after 3 years of being forced to stay away for reasons you know all too well. And it's a pleasure to be back here. So thank you very much, folks at NCAER, for the very nice invitation, and I'm honored to give this lecture. So after telling you, I want to go back just a bit, like 2 centuries. Well, in India, that's nothing. It's to me, in America, this sounds like something. The start of the modern economic world a half a century ago was quickly accompanied by opening and liberalization of economic activity, both domestic and international. And we all know that Adam Smith was our great hero in that one, saying that the purpose was not the mercantilist one of exports, but perhaps it should be making more productive societies, which of course is what we now all want to do. And as transport and communications costs fell, and times of transport and communication fell, and governments relaxed controls on economic activity, notice all four things, they're all important, real world GDP growth accelerated. The estimate is the country with the highest growth rate over the entire 19th century was the Great Britain, 1.5% per capita per year. What would India do today if that's all you got? We learned how to do it better. We got the economics sometimes better. And other things, of course, innovation, but relaxation of controls, falling transport costs and all that was important. World GDP growth accelerated. As that happened, the growth of international trade and economic integration was part and parcel of that growth. Results were phenomenal, and increasingly so over time. Economic historians speak, however, of the, quote, great divergence, unquote, by which they mean that the growth in living standards of the advanced countries had started rising rapidly, while the rest of the world continued to have about the same living standards as it had had millennia before. And I kid not. The economic historians think that the standards of living in Egypt in 1500, before the Common Era, were about the same as the living standards in England in 1800. The quality of the roads built in 1800 were far inferior to the roads the Romans had built in 1800 years before. The world made little progress for a very long time until Adam Smith. Other things happened too, of course. And there was progress that maybe we can't even see. I mean, after all, factories, the goods went up at the top and they were dropped down as they were worked upon until the finished product came on the bottom floor. I mean, things were different, and there was some progress because that was a big improvement over what became before, but we can't even see it practically. Anyway, until the Second World War, the gap in living standards between the West and the rest, as they sometimes say, was of course increasing, so it was even greater in 1945 or 1950 than it was in 1800, when everybody had been about the same, or 1750 when everybody was about the same. The great divergence might have ceased after 1945, but developing countries, and I'm going to call them all developing countries, developing countries. They were then underdeveloped countries, is the formal name, just to remind you. But I'm going to call everybody a developing country, whether they're now middle income or lower income. As long as they were developing or underdeveloped in 1950, I'll use the term, almost uniformly chose to follow policies of import substitution, believing that they needed to develop the new industries of the same type that were already found in the advanced countries. And just having those industries was what made everybody developed. They therefore imposed tariffs and quantitative restrictions on imports of goods when they decided they should be produced domestically. The advanced countries, however, continued to follow the open trade policies, so divergence increased between 1950 and 1975, even though the developing countries very often had the pound reserves built up during World War II and things like that to help them so they could run big current account deficits. Import substitution was not helping them grow as much as the developed, in percentage terms, as much as they should grow. Divergence increased, and the developed countries grew faster until about the mid-1970s. Unlike earlier eras, though, at the end of World War II, the victors chose not to use their power to charge reparations and bully the rest of the world, but instead worked to establish an international order, both economic and political, by which I mean the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and so on. On the economic side, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, was established, which set the principles and rule of law by which trade could be conducted. The basic principles were, and they're important, and there are 5 of them, and they still hold today for the WTO because the articles of the GATT were incorporated into the WTO, and they're important. Non-discrimination by members against other members. If I charge a tariff against India of 20%, I cannot charge any higher tariff or any lower tariff to any other country, because if it were lower, I'd be discriminating against India, and if it were higher, I'd be discriminating against them. So non-discrimination is we treat all other member countries of the WTO as it now is the same. The second principle, well, the first was called the most favored nation treatment, and the legal wording was the commitment to treat this signatory the same as the most favored nation was treated. That's the legally way you do that. Okay, the second principle was national treatment for foreigners, meaning that I get if I want to work and sell something in your market, and we have a disagreement because you're here and I'm there, I'm entitled to the same treatment in your courts or you're in mine as domestic nationals. The second principle, national treatment, is very important. If you can pick on foreigners in your courts, and whatever the domestic person will win, there's not going to be anything trade. There just won't be. You've got to have the contract. So that was important too. Transparency in laws and regulations affecting trade, by which the WTO meant that if you have something where you want to do something, you got to use a tariff, which everybody can see. You can't use hidden behind the border subsidies and say that you're trading fairly, because you're not. The next one was, of course, forbearance against using any protectionist measures against imports except tariffs. In addition, the GATT was to do one other very big thing. It was to serve as a secretariat for members' reciprocal multilateral tariff negotiations. Member countries were to meet to ask for their trading partners to reduce tariffs on their exports. I go to you and I say, I've been importing your cloth and I've been charging you 50%. You've been importing my wheat and you've been charging me 40. I'll go down so much if you'll go down so much. So we reciprocally negotiate, and notice with most favored nation, everybody else gets the benefit of those lower tariffs, including even, and remember this, the developing countries that didn't lower their tariffs. So the developing countries are busy with multilateral trade negotiations. The world is liberalizing further, and the developing countries aren't lowering theirs, so they're still falling behind. There were some exceptions to the Gat Rules, which the developing countries insisted upon, and for many purposes hurt them, not all of them. Some are obvious. For example, an exception to the tariffs only rule was made when countries were deemed that they had to protect an industry for national security reasons. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? And it was used reasonably until I regret to say 2017, when, of course, Donald Trump used national security as an argument to put tariffs on everybody. The reason in law that he did it was national security. Even aluminum, of which the only country for which the United States imported swallowed, was Canada, which provided all American bauxite, and which the American unions, aluminum, were processing bauxite into aluminum, the American owners of the using industries and so on all protested. We nonetheless, it was national security to let these guys have no bauxite to make aluminum with, I think. I don't think any chemist has yet discovered the process, but it might happen. Anyway, that was what it is. Import restrictions were allowed for health and safety reasons, which makes sense, because that enabled prohibition of imports of drugs and weapons of kinds that you don't want, so that's reasonable, again, if it's used reasonably. Third, if a member deemed that an import came from a trading partner was being, quote, again, dumped, it could register a claim to the country and the GATT, which the GATT would adjudicate. That meant the trade disputes between countries could be peacefully resolved and trade wars avoided. The rules, what's important there is not whether dumping is allowed or disallowed. What's important, however, is how you define dumping. Economists would agree that if there's some country out there that's making 60% of the world's supply of something, and they sell below cost, that's dumping. Why? Because they're trying to establish a monopoly in the world market. We don't want that, so that's okay. The United States, however, has insisted on a much more relaxed rule of dumping and has been the champion user, although India has given us some competition, in using anti-dumping rules most. Given that, the rules and procedures that set down by the GATT were very ambiguous. And the GATT disputes procedure was then, and WTO was then supposed to solve them. The way it was supposed to work is if a country thought it was having something, or dumped in its economy, it could complain and send a copy of the complaint to the country and to the now WTO, and I'll just use WTO for a shorthand. And when it did so, what happened was that then the dispute settlement mechanism, DSM, was set up. It was supposed to be the case, first off, countries were supposed to negotiate directly one-on-one, and if they could, they'd resolve the dispute. And of course, the complaint had to be that the country had what? Charged too much when it had agreed not to an import, or indeed it was violating some other part, or indeed it's selling below cost. If the countries couldn't agree as to what was happening, then the GATT panel was supposed to adjudicate it. And they could decide that, okay, the United States really is cheating on this, they're selling it too low, and the United States has to pay damages. That would have worked if it happened very much. It didn't, because everybody knew about that. On the other hand, it could also happen that Honduras thought that the United States was dumping something, and Honduras had to pay damages. But Honduras would have had to pay huge damages relative to its income, whereas the U.S. raised, so it was a little bit biased in the mechanism already. It got biased in other directions. But the U.S. also abused it, as I will come back to. The fourth major exception was a country could break the non-discrimination rule, but that required all imports of all commodities imported to your country to be subject to the same low or no tariff, okay? So that if we form a customs union, we will charge no tariff to all outside countries. That's what preferential trading means. You can have a preferential trading arrangement, however, under some circumstances, which I won't go into because that's technical again, under which you can have different tariffs to different countries. But on the other hand, you have to worry about how Mexico, with its low tariff, sends goods to the United States with its high tariff, so it complicates things. But be that as it may, you could have a customs union like the European Union, like NAFTA, like whatever free trade agreements there are here, but they had to be subject to rules. The rules were it had to be all commodities. You couldn't have a free trade agreement where, okay, we'll lower our tariffs on automobiles, but everything else stays at the same tariff rates. It had to be all, and it had to be done in a way where you compensated countries that lost market on account of it, which Spain got money at one point because they'd entered into the European Union, and there was something in the United States that lost, I've forgotten what it was, their share of the Spanish market, and so the Spaniards had to pay the U.S. something. That's okay, that's fair enough. But then, of course, the third one was that it had to come in force in a reasonable period of time. You need that as a legal rule, because otherwise the United States, for example, could have agreed for free trade agreement with Mexico and said, we will lower our tariffs such and such and such and such. And every time you complained, they would have just said, we'll do it later. You can't do that. You've got to have a time limit. So that was the other one. The fifth exception was concerned developing countries. And that, of course, is, as you know, developing countries insisted that they should be allowed to use tariffs for purpose of protecting their infant industries. And we all know what an infant industry is, or we think we do. But if I were asking you privately and wanted to give you a very hard time, no matter what you said, I could ask you another question. You wouldn't know either within a half an hour, I think, because it's a very difficult thing to define for a lot of reasons. And, of course, in cases where they were paid in balance of payments difficulties. And balance of payments difficulties, as everyone here knows, are subject to bad macro policy, where your expenditures are greater than your income, and you're running a balance of payments deficits and so forth, which could only happen with a fixed exchange rate or with bad macro. But developing countries chose to use that one, keep their exchange rates artificially, unrealistically fixed at more valuable levels than they should have been, in which case, of course, they couldn't export too much, and they imported too much because it was profitable to do so. The GATT came into force in 1947, and world trade, of course, grew very rapidly. World trade had grown in not primary commodities, but in finished goods, at twice the rate of growth of whole world GDP, almost continuously, not by a year, but over decades, at twice the rate of growth of the world economy. World trade, since at least 1800 and probably before, has always been, in that sense, a leader or an engine of growth. It has always been that the countries that opened up found that they were more productive and so on, and so they were growing more rapidly, and that spilled over because of more exports. You get it more rapidly, and that helped. Now, in the years after many rounds, 8, I think, of trade negotiations within the GATT WTO, tariff rates on industrial goods among developed countries were estimated to have fallen from about 40 to 50%, get this, in the 1940s, to 4 to 6% in the early 2000s. And even on other goods, things had fallen. And of course, transport costs had fallen. And of course, on top of that, the time for communications and what have you had fallen dramatically. So the world was integrating in trade. It was integrating, and you could integrate in trade part because you could place the order quickly, call and complain about the import being late, fast, and all those things. So everything fed on everything else, and it worked very well. Now, by the late 1970s, of course, the first quarter century after the war had witnessed the most rapid sustained growth of world GDP of any quarter in human history, despite the fact that developing countries were going more slowly. Developing countries grew faster than they ever had. Developed countries grew faster than they ever had. It was a successful period for the world, which basically ended with the oil price increase of 1973. In the late 1970s, after that had happened, world trade continued to be double the rate of world GDP. And so successful had the open multilateral trading system been, the GATT members agreed, which they could never do today on anything, to strengthen the GATT and make it the World Trade Organization. An agreement is something signed by my president. An organization is a treaty that goes through Congress here and there. Therefore, the rules are more legally binding, and we wanted more of that, and we wanted intellectual, other things brought in that were now coming part of the trading system or tied to it. The World Trade Organization was formed as a successor to GATT and came into being in 1994. The GATT articles were all incorporated into the WTO and applied to, of course, the trade of goods in the WTO, but more services trade, agricultural trade was started to be brought in. To be a quick way to say what was a very complicated thing. The big thing that happened, actually, was that the dispute settlement mechanism was greatly strengthened. And as of, let's say, 2005 or 10, most trade economists and lawyers, I believe, would have said that the dispute settlement mechanism strengthening was the most important thing that had changed. It really was working better, it was working faster and more smoothly, and it was understood better, and it prevented more disputes. It wasn't that it all solved them. Some of them never came there because with a stronger settlement, of course, you didn't have to have it. So there we went again. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, the developing countries had those high walls of protection, and they continued them until later on for a bit, but by the 1990s, policies were changing. We know that economists had recognized the benefits of open trade since the days of Adam Smith, but it was not economic theory, but actually, believe it or not, it was experience that finally taught the lesson. Partly it was the negative results of import substitution, slow growth, chronic foreign exchange shortages, monopolistic behavior on the part of domestic industries which faced little or no competition or worse, poor quality of goods, slow or negative growth of exports because of the wrong exchange rate and other things in the domestic market was profitable, and finally stop-go cycles of macroeconomic activity. Every time you couldn't pay the bills anymore, you had to slow down economic activity until you get usually an IMF program, and then get some resources, the funds would start flowing, and maybe then export activity would pick up. And some countries could do it all over again. Argentina, I think, may have the world record, but many other countries competed in the game of who could go many times around that cycle, and of course some continue, including Argentina, continue to do so. But at the same time, and more important, the ability of an order-oriented trade strategy to generate more rapid growth had been demonstrated by the experiences of the four so-called East Asian tigers: Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. Taiwan was the first actually to abandon import substitution about 1955, and already by 1960 had doubled its exports. And it had been known as a country that had none. South Korea was supposed to be the most pathetic country in the world in 1955, let's say. Ghana's per capita income at about that time was 22 times that of South Korea's per capita income. 22 times, Ghana. Today, I don't know what percentage Ghana's is of South Korea, but I think it would be on the order of 10% or something like that. So 22 times as much, 90% less. over a period of years. Ghana had, of course, maintained its old policies, kept its times when they couldn't even afford to clean the streets and stuff like that, really, really badly, and South Korea changed its policy. Same things happened with Singapore. Hong Kong was always a free trade area, and the abrupt changes where they were so remarkable that they drew everybody's attention. Everybody knew about this. It was a miracle. In domestic prices that Korea had in 1960, 10 years later, they had an average growth rate of GDP of 13% per year. Not per capita total. Well, even that with per capita was still more than 10. And everybody else was ignoring it for a while until it became, one important thing actually was that Korea had the IMF World Bank meetings there in 1960, whatever it was. And people saw what had happened. They couldn't believe it. They knew Korea had been one of the poorest countries in the world, and here was skyscrapers, industrial economy, etc. It was amazing. And people from the rest of the world saw that, and that began making a difference too. Be that as it may, exports in Korea in 1950s were 2 or 3% of GDP. By 1960, they were 13. 2 to 3 remained the export number, and the rest was foreign aid. About that time, the Korean, highest inflation rate in the world and all this, they began changing policies, and starting with an IMF program, exports began growing rapidly with a different exchange rate, etc. And after a decade of virtual stagnation after war, of course, what happened was exports tripled within a short period of time, and things changed. How am I doing on time? I must be in bad shape, right? Am I okay on time? Okay. There's no question but growth was export-led, and all of this was great success. Many other reforms were introduced. I'm not saying this was only exports, because if you do exports right, you can only do that if you do other things right too. Macro has to be in reasonable shape. You can't have some hugely profitable domestic sector that's ignored. You can't leave 70% of the people in agriculture. And real wages in South Korea, as people moved into the cities, going from 80% rural to finally now, I think 4% rural now. Going through all that period with all of that, real wages between 1960 and 1995 grew by 8% per year. Real wages. No other country, to my knowledge, has done that for anything like that long a period. Of course, they were so badly distorted before, that's why they could do it. And if you're not distorted, you can't do as much. But the rest, as they say, really is history. South Korea went from one of the poorest countries in the OECD and joined the OECD by 1990, early 90s. There have been difficult challenges, including especially the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, but no observer could doubt that South Korea had achieved a virtual miracle. The government was active, but much of its activity was centered on ensuring that infrastructure was adequate to meet exporters' need. While incentives were provided for good economic performance, and especially for export, those incentives were uniform across economic activities. They did not say that they would reward steel producers 10% per dollar of exports, and ladies' wigs, 30%. In fact, ladies' wigs were the first big export of Korea after 1960. Who would ever have, and they always want to, if you say we should change strategy, first question, what is it we could export? Well, who on earth would have thought of it? Ladies' wigs. No? Think about it. What would be the exports here if you really opened up? It's amazing. I don't know. No idea. I can think of a few things that might be more likely than a few other things, but I'm not sure. Nobody thought Infosys would come up here. I mean, these things, when they happened, it's somebody has the idea and the incentives are stuff that they didn't, and we learned that in that, so that in the 1990s, lots of other countries followed, including notably, but not only, Chile, India to a degree, Turkey, which took off all its tariffs, and many other developing countries of the way. Growth rates of developing countries for the first time exceeded those of developed countries, and the great divergence began to close. So the developing world began more rapidly. The number in poverty since then has been reduced enormously, and until then it was rising. Export-oriented strategies were, of course, more successful when accompanied by needed internal reforms, and that's still true, and reforms have to continue if you want to keep it up. Nonetheless, growth rates responded to the opening. After the Second World War, trade in goods and services was about 20% of world GDP. Now it's around 60, as contrasted with 20. However, of course, we had the Great Recession which was the first big shock of this century. And it was the severest downturn in economic activity since the Great Depression. And of course, it spread quickly. Protectionist pressures did rise, and some protection was. Most economists like me were astonished that there wasn't more given the severity of the downturn, and we thought it was pretty successful, and I think it was. Countries did basically not do too much more protection. But then came the second blow, which was, of course, the global pandemic. I can change the number if I want to, but I'll go to the global pandemic, which erupted in December 19, and whose consequences became alarmingly clear by the second quarter 2020. The shortages of healthcare products, the sharp shift in demand patterns, consequent disruptions of supply chain led to cries in many places for protection. Already there are good studies, however, showing that when countries stayed open and began exporting masks and importing some pharmaceuticals or whatever, they did much better than if they did it all themselves. And the economists are mostly fighting to try and prevent people. One of the successful things of the WTO, and I'll come back to the end, but one of the successes was people agreed not to put restrictions on exports. The WTO members will no longer put on export restrictions on their exports of healthcare products. I have not learned the word. I have not looked at the wording, much less learned it, but that's approximately what the agreement says. Some countries attempted to limit them, but they stopped. Policies in many countries proposed also that they didn't want supply chains to be disrupted. Now, one of the true facts of life in this world about human nature, in fact, I believe it's probably principle number one, is that deep down, everybody has an instinct to be protectionist. And when there's a chance for protection, when you want to make it in the political arena, you don't wait until there's a real reason. If there's something like the environment, my God, let's get, the labor unions can say, oh, look at this, if we don't do this, the environment will be worse. If we don't do it, something else. Sometimes the arguments are even contradictory. It doesn't matter. People are protectionists, and people want to hear protectionist arguments, so they get them. And with it, whether subsidies or tariffs, measures clearly increase barriers to trade, and the supply chain issue was wonderful. Of course, we need to be self-sufficient in this. Ridiculous, of course, but nonetheless, I mean, the United States wants to be protectionist in steel, so we'll raise the price domestically 50%, which is what we did, so the price abroad would be lower by a third than our price. That will be true of all steel users in the United States, now at a competitive disadvantage with our steel producers abroad. So we might make a few jobs in steel, although in fact we didn't, because we made the jobs. Everybody says, oh, this is terrible for steel, but to give you just one example, since 1980, productivity per worker in steel in the United States has gone tenfold. We would have had to have a 10 times increase the amount of steel people wanted to use, not to lose jobs in steel. Come along environment, the steel workers are delighted because now they need, because somehow or they think, I think they're wrong actually, they protect more. So environmentalists are for protection for steel. And on it goes. And the same thing has now happened with supply chains. We need to have this stuff at home. The fact that Canada may be closer to where we need it than Colorado doesn't matter. We need to protect it at home. And this is going on now, so we're getting the same thing. And President Trump was the third blow to the economy. I've got him third, even though he's, of course, second. And, of course, we, the U.S., had been the leader of the international system. We'd been the one that were going to do the rule of law. And we'd had a running dispute over the years, however, with the WTO over the interpretation of this anti-dumping countervailing duties, because, of course, we know that anybody that does better than we are is unfair, which is not necessarily the case, but our dumping laws are that way. And we did not think all of the Gat WTO rules were as fair as they should be. So starting about that time, but a little bit before, the U.S. began saying, hey, we're not being allowed to do anti-dumping everywhere we should, and basically refused to approve the appointment of any new judges to the dispute settlement mechanism. By the 1919, I think it was, 2019, I don't know which century this is, I'm so jet lagged, but other than that, it's okay. But be that as it may, by 2019, there were no more judges. So right now, the WTO has no dispute settlement mechanism. 26 countries, Europe counting as one, have signed an agreement among themselves which basically mirrors the DSM, and they're using it. The United States is not one, busy getting anti-dumping to protect us losing industries. Anyway, with all of that, and with the steel being done, and complaints over anti-dumping and CVD being encouraged, and the trade war with China then declared, the United States had removed itself from any leadership position, and it had, to my pride, until 2016, we had done very well, not only by ourselves, but by the rest of the world by doing this. We had negotiated the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, but we insisted, or he insisted, the president, that that agreement and many others be renegotiated. There were agreements in which everybody politically had given up something. President Trump didn't like it, so he went for something more. And so when President Biden came in, the first hope was, of course, that he would remove all the tariffs from the Trump era. He is an internationalist, and he has done many things. So far, he has not really touched tariffs or protection in general, and that's too bad. The Chinese tariffs remain in place, although last week, the day I left, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that the Biden administration is split, and half of them now want to go and do something to remove those tariffs on China, and something may be moving under the surface, but so far there's been no action. The dispute settlement mechanism remains inoperative. We do have, as I said, the substitute mechanism, but not with all countries, and so it goes. We had negotiated the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, as you know, under Obama, and it was agreed and all is set. And one of the things President Trump, I think it was his second day in office, did was tear it up. The other 11 signatories in Asia have, of course, signed it. So, of course, he achieved wonders because now Australian wheat can go into Japan with zero tariffs, and American tariffs pay 37%. Wheat pays 37%, and so it goes. There's no way that was good for America, no way it was good for the world. And to my great disappointment so far, President Trump has not even brought that one back. But the other 11 countries are going well. Japan has taken leadership under late Prime Minister Abe, who was very instrumental in that and a great world leader. And he saw the importance of this, and he is the one that brought the 11 other together in that mechanism. Anyway, then came the last blow, most recent, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has given even more aid and comfort to those who think that scissors, for example, has to be protected for national security. And I swear, I have heard in writing, I've seen in writing, where two scissors companies sworn they're necessary for national defense, because otherwise how could you make uniforms for soldiers? And on it goes. Protection is everywhere around us. And economists have a responsibility, I think, to do something about it. Anyway, right now the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, who I'm pretty sure is on the good side, has announced, but I think she's alone in the cabinet, she's announced that the U.S. is now going, because of national security issues, we're going to friendshore future trade relations, which is to say we'll keep the open system. I think she's doing the best she can. I don't think this will work for a whole variety of reasons. But she said that we will friendshore, i.e. keep open trade with our friends. The interesting question is, how do you legally define a friend? And if you do define a friend, then what happens when the government changes, as, for example, it might change in Sri Lanka? Suppose the next government isn't a friend. What in law do you write to say that? What in law do you say when, for example, maybe the Colombian, or that's a bad example, but a country who had been, quote, inimical had then gone the other way? How do you make them a friend? The legality of friendship, it strikes me, is one of the, I'm not a lawyer, but I would guess is one of the things that even a lawyer would be challenged to do in any meaningful way. Certainly nothing close to what we want. Anyway, all of these things we have gone badly and not well. The urgent need, however, to act multilaterally with regard to environmental concerns and to a lesser extent to act multilaterally with regard to Ukraine have both become to the fore in political circles in recent years. On top of that, COVID is an international issue. And with all of that, recognition on the part of all of us, I think, that we are interdependent, that we have to work with each other, that we cannot just go it alone, I think is going to be even stronger, I hope so, maybe I'm an optimist, than it has been. And some things seem to be moving a bit that way. Even the Chinese seem to be willing to work on some of the environmental issues without quite the degree of difficulty that there is in some other. In the case of the pandemic, of course, it's sufficiently contagious so that a flare-up anywhere in the world is bound to concern others as well. Healthcare products are now, I think, it's more agreed, will be open multilaterally and so on. Environmental concerns, of course, there's no point in me cutting down my emissions. If you're my neighbor and you're just going to get the business, and you can do it instead of me, you might even be more worse. And world pollution might go up because I protect, so now you're polluting even worse, and I gave my big guys higher costs. So what happens? People buying the product will buy from the polluter, and if he was a heavier polluter, you might get more protection. It has to be international. It's obvious it has to be international. It's also obvious that if one country protects its environment by agreeing to, let's say, carbon adjustment, which is probably the best thing, and almost all economists agree on carbon adjustment taxes, and carbon taxes so that the more heavier emitters will pay more. Almost everybody agrees that it would be perfectly justified then for a country which put on high tariffs, which reflected appropriately the cost of the environment. It would be legitimate then, in fact desirable, to make sure that the other country with whom you're trading for the same industry does the same thing. Because if they don't, well, first off, our industry will complain legitimately, and the political pressures will be such. But if we don't agree on it internationally, something else is going to happen. And that's going to be that the countries who put on those taxes are going to agree that they are going to say that they can impose taxes to offset or compensate the taxes that were put on there. So if we put on a $50 a ton tax on steel because it's polluting, and if, for example, Mexico does not, it would be perfectly reasonable for the United States steel producer to say, hey, this is an unfair cost disadvantage. Mexico's eating our lunch, and we want to tax Mexican imports of steel $50 a ton, right? That's fair. Okay, if Mexico then doesn't put on its taxes, it's going to be contributing to the United States Treasury. And that is what is going to happen in the world, I think, if countries don't put on their own carbon taxes. Because it's one of these, it's perfectly legitimate for me to say, hey, you've got an unfair advantage. I'll put on tax to offset it, and that is fair enough because it's not a real economic cost like other things. We are getting rid of an environmental cost, they are not. Why should they get the cost advantage from that? I mean, I'm for carbon taxes, and I am for border tax adjustment, and I am for countries recognizing that they shouldn't be paying the money to the European Union or the United States or one of those, anybody else. They should be taxing their own. It's obvious. And it isn't that they should tax because they clean their own environment. It is that they should tax because if they don't, they'll be paying into the United States Treasury and the European Central Bank. Doesn't make any sense. So without an international agreement on the WTO elsewhere, there's a strong risk, and this is important, the lobbyists will seek border adjustment taxes regardless of whether they're warranted or not. We need an international agreement that producing steel of such and such a density and of such and such a cover, whatever, should be $10 a ton, and then we need everybody to do it. If not, I guarantee that the U.S. steel producers will go in and they'll say, hey, wait, those guys don't have any, and your taxing is too much, so we need a 30% tariff, or whatever. And the protectionists will have a heyday. So there are two reasons for doing it. One, the protectionists will get you when you don't, and two, the tax revenue will go to the government. Now, until very recently, I'm getting close to the end, the outlook for restoring the WTO, and perhaps even for the prevention of a descent into heightened protectionism, appeared very, very strong and very discouraging. The issues confronting the WTO and the trading system were daunting. They included all the new issues around the environment, supply chain vulnerability, pandemic, etc., etc., on and on. The ministerial conference, which was supposed to be held in 2019, I think, was postponed because of COVID and held in June. There was even in such a friendly to free trade newspapers in New York Times, it was said that the WTO was, and I quote, to make sure you know they understood the word they said, broken. The WTO was dead. You couldn't do anything anymore. The friend-shoring suggested the United States implied at least we might have a few trading blocks, but it never suggested open multilateral trading, which is what we need. However, the outcome of MC12 surprised everybody. Several important agreements were reached. Food insecurity, which was a major concern since the Ukrainian invasion, was addressed, among other things, and I'm going quickly through just some of them to give you an idea, because many countries had complained they couldn't get food imports because exports had been cut off, right? It was addressed with an agreement there would be no export restrictions or blockages of any kind to block the World Food Program from getting its food through the poor. Anyway, that's huge, right there. That would have been enough almost to justify the existence of the WTO. The World Food Program is important, and it helps a lot of poor people. The agreement on restricting fisheries substitution, fisheries subsidies was at last, after 30 years, resolved. And we now have a fisheries agreement to save the fisheries that were being fished out so that we lost the fishes in the ocean. We now have an agreement after 30 years of fighting, and it was the WTO that did it. Amazing and wonderful. And it shows also that the environmentalists need the WTO for some of the things they're doing, because obviously depletion of fisheries is international, it's environmental, and we have to have an agreement somewhere, and who can penalize other than the WTO? It's wonderful, and it's good news for all of us, but it's only a first step. There is much, much more. Vaccine patents will not be charged on vaccines until 2027, I think, is the year. All of these things came out last month, and everybody who was there reports that the mood was different, and all of the delegates were surprised that everybody else thought the WTO was that important. They thought they were the only one. And they got together, and it's only a first step, but it is good news. There's even, believe it or not, a commitment that by December, the WTO delegates will have come up with a way to resolve the dispute settlement mechanism, court dispute, and so on and so on. To commit, in the international community, when you commit to do something in a certain time and it's done, you just stop the clock. So I'm not quite, sure that it will be done, but it might be done. Who knows? It's only a first step. It takes more than good intentions. And there is going to be a WTO study of what are the needed reforms and how to do it. And if you think reforming something like the rule of law in trade in international circles, when different countries think they have their differential agreements, you can do two things. One, you conclude that you can never do it bilaterally, which is certainly true. The other is that while you can only do it multilaterally, that is going to be the biggest job ever undertaken. I mean, it's going to be huge, but we have to hope and we have to help them do it. It's important. Trade and the rule of law for trade are critical for the world as a whole. And the new issues such as e-commerce, movement of data across countries, and the environment are all there. They need to be resolved. We need to do it multilaterally, and that means the WTO. Anybody who says, why don't we just form a new organization, means very well, but they have no idea what would happen. And I guess maybe if we gave them 30 years, they might get there, but I doubt if they could do it any sooner. It's too hard, among other things, and too many ideas, and everybody agrees it ought to be reformed, but we can all agree we don't like something, but that doesn't mean we can agree on what we'd like instead. And in this case, you'd have to agree on that, and that's where a problem arises. There are many steps that the United States should take, and I hope it will. And I'm ashamed to be talking about my country this way, but it's doing very poorly so far, even in this administration, on this issue. Those joining the new MPIA, which is the multilateral agreement that covers the 26 dispute settlements and so on, we didn't get, and we've got to do that. The U.S. should do that. We should get the revisions of the dispute settlement mechanism going. It should be, the U.S. should improve its position on anti-dumping and counter-duty rates. So I want all this for my own country. And I'm sure, I know, that there are lots of things here that should be done in India and elsewhere. But before, 20 years ago, had I given a talk like this, the United States not only was reasonably virtuous, which it's not quite so longer, but on top of that, it led some leadership. There was no problem there. But the U.S. now no longer can be quite the leader it was for good reason. I mean, the U.S. just didn't have the power, economic power it did. We aren't that important in world trade as we were, and it wasn't necessary for countries to agree so much with the U.S. in order to keep trade channels open. So there's every reason for large trading countries, and India is one, but only one, to start taking a stronger leadership role and recognizing that not only do they have interests in the narrow sense, but they have even more of an interest in the rule of law and in keeping a WTO and making it stronger than do the big, powerful countries. The rule of law prevents the bullies from going after the small guy. And the United States and China are both bullies, and some of the smaller ones should be gagging together more than they have, and getting a larger say because they make sense and saying, not instead of saying we don't like, we don't like, we don't like. And many people in all countries have been doing that, and we face possibly the risk of the end of the system as a result. China is now an important trading country. There are a lot of common interests with the rest of the world regarding the environment, health issues, and much more. And trade is sufficiently important to the Chinese economy that there need to be found ways to address some of their concerns, especially by the US and the EU, within a multilateral context, not bilaterally. May be far more effective. If the US and the EU and China, Japan, Korea, India can sit down together, maybe a small group of 8 or something, and work out some of these things together, it would be far more effective than if each of us goes to Beijing and says, we don't like you because you're doing this. There also has to be something that's given back to the Chinese. And that's what I think everybody forgets about. When you're bargaining, you don't say, you do A, B, C, D. That's not the bargain. The bargain is when I do A, B, C, and they get D and E. And we've got to do some work. Academics and others need to do some work on that. So there's a very strong interest in a well-functioning WTO. The WTO members became accustomed to American leadership, which, as I said, I thought was good. It's not going to be quite as strong for good reason and bad, but that means it's equally important for other countries to learn better. The MC-12 is the first really good news I've heard on trade in a long time, but it was astonishingly good news. The rest of the world is beginning to learn that we are one world, and that's important, and I hope it will then. And for those recognizing the gains from the liberalized trading system, there has been a tendency to presume that trading blocs such as the EU can provide many of the gains that would result from an open multilateral system. And everybody else says, EU, that was good, right? Well, it was good. But what we ignore is the EU tariffs among themselves, when they joined the world WTO, were 45 to 50%. They were above average in tariff levels. They reduced their external tariffs from 45 to 50% to 5. Internal tariffs from 45 to 50%, which is what they were, to 0. Which do you think made the bigger difference to WTO? The EU's trade with the rest of the world has increased almost as much as internal trade. Everybody else, we didn't have a preferential trading risk, so we didn't have that part. But it was the multilateral opening, I think, more than the EU integration that led even to the EU's success with its high growth and all that. Now, even if trading blocs or isolationist trade policies are adopted by many, other countries are going to be smart enough to stay open to trade. And they will outcompete those who raise their border barriers. No doubt about it. It's happened over and over. As the disadvantages and losses associated with disintegration of the system become more apparent, and as the gains to those countries that don't do that also become evident, just as the Asian tigers showed earlier on to the developing countries what could be done, what's going to happen is that those nations, which basically follow the open system and don't do that, are going to be the countries that succeed most, and others will follow them eventually. I don't like that outcome because it's going to mean 10 or 15 or 20 years of more sluggish growth and more sluggish trade than there needs to be. So in the long run, I'm optimistic. Somebody's going to figure out that the ones that don't protect do better. But in the shorter run, I'm not quite so sure. And while it's possible for that, it has to be fervently hoped that the very large losses that would be incurred in relearning the lessons and rediscovering the wheel can be avoided. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Krueger. That was a wonderful lecture, and just as I had predicted, we had the treat that was promised.
So we have about, I'd say, Professor Krueger has to leave at 7, so we have about 27 minutes to do Q&A. Praveen, maybe, shall I? Okay. Professor Krueger, I want to go back a little bit into history. This concerns India. In 1960, Ian Little visited India, and he had these discussions on the third five-year plan. And then he went back to MIT. I think he was at the time a visitor at MIT or something. So, and wrote an article where he wrote that something along the following lines: that they are doing the right thing. They are planning to do import substitution, and the market is there. There is no uncertainty about it, and they can all produce these things at home and all. By 1970, he is the one who actually led the OECD project, the Little, Skitowski, and Scott, and there was a different Ian Little. Why is it that so many economists went wrong, right? I mean, the consensus was that the developed countries should open up and all, and so GATT was formed and all. But at the same time, most seemed to be in the 1950s, or immediate post-Second World War, almost all economists felt that it was okay for the developing countries to actually go through import substitution.
How many to answer right away? I'm happy to.
Please go.
Give me 2 hours. Okay, quickly. Remember the Great Depression. It led to a lot of disillusionment with the market system, number one. Number two, the infant industry argument had already been there, and as I said, protectionist bones are in almost everybody's DNA, and when there's an infant industry argument, everybody went to, I had friends in graduate school who, when they were coming back to India, I had some from other countries too, they learned enough in graduate school that when they came home, they took a look at the import list of what was still not banned. They figured, okay, I can produce this. They went to the government and they said, please may I get my investment license and then all the rest of it. And once they did that, they started producing, and the government of India cut off the imports. Now that gives that domestic company a monopoly. The next guy comes home. What is he going to do with the guy that's highly profitable? Compete with him or find the next thing on the import list? Anything that somebody said they could produce, as you know, I do not know of a case where the government of India turned down imports, and I looked, import substitution firm. I do not know. Once it started, then Indian companies were dependent on it and very quickly went. Indian was a friend. I brought him to the World Bank actually when I was there. And among others, and Jagdish and I, we didn't start with that view. We were taught import substitution. We were taught infant industry. We learned all that in graduate school, but you went out in the world and you looked. And the project I did with Jagdish started one night at a conference where Jagdish and Michael Bruno and I were sitting around, and Jagdish was talking about India. I was at the time working on Turkey and talked about Turkey. Michael talked about Israel, and that was the genesis for the thing, because despite the differences in size and everything else between those three countries, when we talked about what was going wrong, and Israel was at the time import substitution. What was going wrong in those countries, it was almost exactly the same. It was unbelievable. And we spent an evening, and it was just not, and the three, Michael did not choose to participate, but he really should have been given credit for being part of the genesis of the project. I do believe the Koreans taught the world, and the other East Asian tigers taught the world a great deal. So it was experience, it was negative, and that helped a lot. You could see, everybody didn't believe it could. In 1975, when I was here, I was pitching, that this isn't too smart. And I got the objection of, well, yes, that's okay, but India is too large to export. Or the world is going to turn more protectionist in Korea. Or that indeed Korea had a benefit of lower tariffs from the United States because of the Korean War, which is not true. But I got all those arguments, by the way, on the too large to export. The Japanese foreign aid minister came here at some point when I was here, and basically looked around for a week or more, however long he was here. And the last night he was invited to, of course, a big dinner. And at the dinner he was asked to say something, and he said, well, I'm very puzzled. You all tell me you're too big to export. I have looked at the export statistics, and I have looked at your population statistics of cities. And I have looked at Singapore, and it's about the same time as, I think he said, Madras, now Chennai. He said, they export twice as much as you do. Why don't you prevent anybody else from exporting and make it only in Singapore? Wonderful mind-focusing response, which nobody heard. Oh, that's mine. Oh, that's yours.
I have a quick question.
Okay, Ravi.
And I wanted to ask you a question relating to a couple of things you touched upon. So under the Trump presidency, we saw kind of fairly aggressive actions coming out of Washington, attacks, if you will, on the international trade system, in particular the WTO, the rules, and so forth. But one fact that you'll agree with is that the lack of support in the US for the dispute settlement mechanism in terms of the reappointment of the judges and so on and so forth, that preceded Donald Trump. So this was under President Obama as well. And then we've seen that since Biden has taken over as president, as you mentioned, that there hasn't been this kind of rush to reverse all of the negative things that Trump did. So my question to you is, this suggests a kind of a continuity from Obama to Trump to Biden in terms of kind of weakening of US position relative to the WTO in terms of kind of leadership position of WTO. Do you see this as something structural? Is there something about the politics of the United States that has changed? Is there something about the economics? Is it income inequality, diminished position of the US in manufacturing? What is going on that is kind of across different administrations, Democrats and Republicans, has kind of allowed this or supported this kind of weakening of US leadership position? So
Well,
it's a bit of a mystery to me, yeah.
I have yet to sit down with any friend, political scientist or economist, when we started to say, how could Trump ever be the weak fighter's answer that we're happy with? So none of us understand how it happened or why it happened. I mean, it really is so far out in outer space relative to where things were. I have lots of partial answers and so on. I think Biden, but I would also distinguish, I think Biden is an internationalist. He wants to move with the European system. He's still enough to think they should move our way, of course. But I mean, he is an internationalist and all that. And I think in that sense, he is better than Trump was in all kinds of ways. Trump really did not like trade. Trump was an isolationist. Now, everybody calls people a nationalist if they want the protect. And I don't think that's right, because I think all of us love our countries. And I think being an internationalist or being proud of my country doesn't make me a nationalist. Or I can be a nationalist and proud of my country without wanting protection. So I don't see those as the same. And I see Biden as someone who is an internationalist, but he doesn't, I'm sure he does not understand the trade issues. I know Janet does, Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, and her friendshoring was quite clearly her sort of lonesome, isolated fight within the administration to get something other than total protection. Now, I also think that over time, protectionist consequences appear and finally become glaring. And my guess is that may happen on steel fairly soon. And there's some other things that might happen that could bring it along faster. It's going to happen. The question is how long it takes. And I think some of the consequences of Trump's actions are not yet even evident. And that they're going to come. I think other things are coming. The U.S. Basically, this is very fast because I won't take long because it's really political science, somebody else. Until the late 1950s at least, the two parties in the United States were very strange because it was really northern alignment between northern Republicans and southern Democrats. Southern Democrats were the predominant party in the South because Lincoln had been a Republican and gotten rid of at least a part of our racist stuff and so on. And the Democrats were the good guys. The Southern Democrats discovered they were more like the Northern Republicans in many regards, and so the parties realigned. So now the Democratic Party everywhere is one way, and the Republican Party of the other. But that meant there used to be, what I knew of as a kid, everybody knew there was an East Coast establishment. They were wealthy people. Henry Cabot Lodge, this kind of person who's Senate, he's wealthy, he's there believing, Nelson Rockefeller, Carnegie. These guys believed that they had their money and they believed they could help the common good, and they did all. Carnegie set up the whole entire public library system in the United States. One guy did that because that was what he thought was good. Others did other things. And then the people who were coming to Washington were that after World War II, when Truman was president, and when Roosevelt had just died, there was Democratic Congress, Democratic Congress, Democratic Senate, Democratic President. Arthur Vandenberg was a Republican, Senate Foreign Relations Committee from Michigan. He went to President Truman and said, look, we can't have partisan foreign policy. We Republicans will work with you. We're going to have a coordinated, foreign policy was bipartisan until the breakup of the Soviet Union. At least I don't know, is there or not? I think it's not as much as it should be. I'll tell you that. So all these things sort of coalescing. We lost the East Coast establishment as the parties realigned. We had Vandenberg, unfortunately, he died. There were about 14 senators as of 2008 who were really willing to work across the aisle, most of them internationalists, both parties. We lost that, and we lost some of them, of course, to death and other things since. So that coalition has broken down, and so on and so forth. I could give you more reasons, but there's a lot of it, and there are pieces. Ukraine is a disaster, and it's a tragedy, and I don't believe it and all the rest of it, but the non-communist, or whatever you want to call it, world is coalescing in a way that was drifting apart primarily, but not only from the United States viewpoint. I think it's certainly come together. Biden's popularity rating on foreign policy issues showed up in the polls at about 40% before Ukraine. It's now about 80. You think that's not a big change? It's huge. In a poll, I just wouldn't have believed it. We're seeing a few other things that are a little more American support and perhaps even realization that we're all in the same boat. Environmentalism is going to help that too. So I think something, even e-commerce, are going to bring us back the other way, but it may not happen quickly.
Okay. Floor is open. Manish.
Thank you, Professor Krueger. That was just fantastic. And we totally agree with you, at least I totally agree with you, that globalization, trade was fantastic for poor countries. I mean, China moved 700 million people from farm to non-farm. Last year, we exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil. But was it really difficult for less educated, less skilled manufacturing workers in America? I mean, is this economic illiteracy the pushback, or is there genuinely a problem here that if you were a less educated, less skilled person in a rich country, for us it was fantastic and we hope it continues, and obviously all the challenges to trade are worrying for us. But is there something real going on in the politics on ground? Because votes are distributed more equally than education and wealth. So is it just economic literacy, or was it really difficult, and will it continue to be difficult for them?
That's obviously a question on which lots of economists have done lots of work. There's pretty good consensus that if you look at what happened in terms of moving up the skill ladder, probably 80 to 85% has been automation and other innovation especially. And what happened, for example, in banks, we don't need bank clerks because we got ATMs, right? But there are more jobs in banks, but those jobs are now the record keeping, keeping the software going, the IT stuff and all that. You don't need tellers who've had only 8 years of school. You need people who've gone on and have got their software education. Now, that's not true only recently. That's been true since 1800. My person who taught me golf was a retired guy whose job when I was in graduate school had been, when he was working, he'd been in the Madison, Wisconsin Fire Department as the horseshoer. Okay? Well, he had lost his job. He was fortunately close enough to retirement. But the demand for horseshoers went not because of imports, but because when that happened, what happened was, of course, that cars had come in and we didn't need as many horseshoers. And that's true of many, I can give you many more examples of this kind of thing, where technology wiped out one, but it also created jobs on the other side. Until about 1980 in the United States, the number of people going to university, getting university degrees, especially technical things, everything, was rising, so the percentage of unskilled workers is falling. Approximately the rate that innovation and other things were driving this, so real wages could rise, as they did, and the gap between the wages of the unskilled and the skilled went down. So we were getting in that direction. After 1980, either innovation went faster, or in the United States, the percentage of college graduates has not gone up, the percentage of high school graduates has not gone up, so we stopped increasing our supply of skilled workers. And it's costly to substitute unskilled workers because you do want a nurse when you've got a doctor. But if you don't have the nurses, the doctors aren't productive. So for a long time, as you're taking people off farms and making them nurses, they're helping productivity because farmers' work go up, nurses, hospitals go up, and so on. When you get to replace the nurses with somebody who can read the radiograph or whatever it is, I don't know all the technical terms, you're replacing an unskilled with a skilled. And some of the technical change, I don't know how much has been of that nature. But even as early as 1980, everybody was saying, or the economists were from their research concluding that it was that. And the interesting thing that makes me believe this business of the shift in technology is that Canada had about the same experience as the US in terms of the wage growth, the skilled, unskilled mix, the increase in university education until about 1980. They continued to increase their percentage skilled, and so I don't know, I haven't seen these numbers in 10 years, so there's something might have happened since. But as of about 2010, the studies then said that, okay, Canada did that, and guess what? The skilled, unskilled gap didn't increase. It kept going down in Canada, it kept going up in the United States. And the difference, if you look just at those raw numbers in big picture terms, Canada had kept on increasing its fraction of skilled workers, and the United States, they'd slow down. That's certainly not all of it. And there must be something somewhere, but it was always true that people got displaced. And if you ask how many people got displaced because of steel, because of trade, what was it, at most, I think, most, you know the number, but I'm drawing a blank, but at most 15% of steel was produced, or was imported when Trump put on those steel tariffs. But even more interesting, capacity utilization was only 70%. We could have expanded anytime we needed to. It would have been some older mills and stuff that weren't as economic, which is why they had closed down. There were more high-tech stuff came in. Guess what? When Trump put on the tariffs, the first thing that happened was those old mills were fired up again. The high-cost, environmentally polluting ones came back into business. Well, that's how yours.
Okay. Yes, please.
So thank you for such brilliant grasp on the trade policy issues and the ongoing thing with such a long history of what has been happening. When I reflect back, I think the biggest question to my mind is why have the free traders lost so badly? I mean, why is it that despite, in theory, still it being the first best, we are only talking of second best of whether TPP is fine, whether RCEP is good or not, is this the way to go for the trade, or go for the third best of bilateral trade agreements? And yet, virtually nobody talks now of what needs to be done to push growth through the trade routes, which are more WTO based and stuff. So secondly, like, is it, one explanation could be that possibly the advanced economies had the trade advantage, and therefore they championed the trade, free trade as a best policy, but the moment they lost the trade advantage, the views changed. A more probably better argument could be that they found the ways of the global value chains as a substitute for trade liberalization. Some of that was sort of giving them that advantage through the GVCs. So they didn't want that much of trade liberalization. But if you see data, I mean, the participation rates for the GVC, whether it's trade-based or production-based, they all rapidly increased between 1995 and till the GFC, and have since then tumbled in the, those participation rates are going down. And the world is paying a huge cost in terms of inflation. So in that sense, what is it that you think is the reason?
Okay, quickly. One, inflation was not caused by trade. Trade made trade inflation, or inflation would have been slightly less had trade not been closed even to the extent it was. Putting on a tariff on steel in the United States raised the price of steel. It's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Getting rid of the tariffs. In fact, now some people are coming around, even in the U.S., saying we need to get rid of those tariffs because that would help dampen inflation. Actually, that wouldn't either, because it's mostly a macro phenomenon. So that one is fairly easy for me to answer, and to be pretty confident that 99.9% of all other economists would agree. Now let's go to, has free trade lost? Well, first off, I think as a citizen of the United States, I can buy just about anything anywhere in the world, or order it, and have it shipped in and get to me within a very short period of time. There are some tariffs, but remember, the world was not all tariffs. Well, you guys should know. I mean, you set quantitative restrictions on everything. You had import prohibitions on most things. Almost nothing was allowed here. Getting suitcases on Air India were jamming up. Nobody had a place to sit because they had so much stuff they were carrying back. Television sets came back from Europe with passengers. India gained so much by opening up a bit. It's not open, but it is more open than it was, and is better off for it by miles. I believe that the growth spurt in India in between 2003 to 2010, or 2013, was largely triggered by, not only, but largely triggered by the opening of trade, which happened when the first finance minister and then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh lowered the tariffs and did the things he did to get that exchange rate realistic and other things. To me, he's a world hero for what he did in that. That was courageous. A lot of people are afraid of trade, and that makes it hard to get rid of things and get rid of that stuff. Having said that, okay, India's tariffs at that time, I don't know what they would have averaged, and it wouldn't have mattered because you couldn't buy it anyway because of a quota. but let me say probably 60% would have been a reasonable estimate of what a tariff equivalent of those things would have been. Okay? The average tariff in the United States then was 30. India is now down to 15 about, and that is a reasonable number because the QRs have gone, so it's an underestimate. U.S. tariffs on manufacturers average 3%. Has free trade lost? Now, if I look year to year, yes, it gets better, it gets worse. As I said, all of us were amazed that protectionist pressures did not get worse than they did during the, actions, not pressures. Actions didn't get worse during the Great Recession. Virtually no discernible protection in the world. And yet historically, when times are bad, Great Depressions, the gut instinct to add to protection has been very real. So I think free traders haven't won the battle, but they haven't lost. One time years ago, the National Science Foundation in the United States decided this was an important question, and they decided they wanted a conference on why, to bring political scientists and economists together. And as it happened, I had a colleague who was a good political science. I was economics, same university, so we were brought to lead these two groups together. So he brought in the political scientists, I brought in the economists. And we were talking about trade and trade pressures and protection. Interestingly to me, I was so stunned I almost couldn't contribute to the conference. I was so puzzled. Because all the economists there asked why there is so much protection. Every political scientist there asked why is there not more protection. True story. Really true, and these are the guys who knew. And I think, I told you, I started by saying everybody's got some protectionism in their bones. And I think there are some things that we instinctively believe that and we have discovered things over the years. I mean, it isn't as if we are doing exactly the same thing in the world we did 2000. Knowledge has improved and we understand this. And now we have tariffs of 3% and we got, at the moment, I regret to say 50% on steel, but we've learned. And President Bush in 2003 tried to protect steel because steel is the best protectionist lobby in the United States. Okay, he tried to protect, he had to take them off within a year and a half because all the steel users complained. Okay, 88,000 steel workers in 2017, 890,000 steel using workers. Steel employment has gone up maybe 10,000, steel using 60,000. Has free trade lost out, or are we just getting more evidence that protection is not a good idea?
Well, I think, all free traders should pretend that the protectionists have won, and so that they celebrate their victory and go home, and we all get to enjoy the free trade. So, unless there is any pressing question, I think, Anne has to leave at 7, and it's already only 3 minutes to 7, and I hesitate to add another question. So, okay, so thanks, Anne. That was a fantastic journey, all the way from Adam Smith to today, and fully updated lecture and a beautiful rendition. Grateful to you, and I'm sure all the audience is very happy that they got to listen to you, and happy journey, safe travels as you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.